What's going on, everybody? This is Fry. So today I'm going to explain to you how to make decks in Plants vs. Zombies Heroes. I'm going to be telling you about some of the mistakes that people make and then actually how to make decks. You'll be able to use this tutorial to make up your own original decks, and here is how it goes. The main mistake I see players do when trying to make a deck is they'll literally go and search for some kind of synergy. They'll say, oh look, we're gonna do P synergy today. So they have all the P's, and then they stick just a bunch of P's in your deck, and you say, hey look, Torchwood, there's P synergy, so I'm gonna put it works well with P's. I'll put Torchwood, I'll just put Podfather in the deck, and I'll just put as many things with P's that say the word P in it as possible. And this is a huge mistake. You can use these sort of tribal synergies in order to really enhance your deck. Synergy is important, but the main synergy that your decks have to have is that every single card in the deck is going to work together for the sole purpose of doing 20 damage to your opponent's face. Your eye has to be on that goal, and you have to have a very clear win condition. Win condition means the way that you're going to finish off your opponent. Now, there are three basic types of decks that you want to be building in Plants vs. Zombies Heroes, and I have them listed right over here. I will be getting into some more advanced ones just in a little bit, but in the meantime, you really have to understand these before you understand anything else. And these are three ways of winning the game, of doing 20 damage to your opponent's face. Number one is aggro. Aggro means do as much damage as possible quickly to your opponent's face. So the deck is usually going to be comprised of high attack minions or bullseye minions. I'll give you a few examples of every single deck as we go along over here. First thing I'm going to show you is this is a perfect deck, Aggro Solar Flare. In fact, if I have the budget one, I'll just show you the budget one for you beginner players out there. This is a perfect aggro deck. Aggro is aggressive. You're going to be doing, so we're looking for high attack minions. The Haunted Pumpkin is a great example, one of the best cards for beginner players to craft. This is a 1-cost card that does 4 damage, huge amounts of attack for a 1-cost card. Even a 2-cost 3 attack guy like Applesaucer is good. In the late game, this will do strike through, so again, it's more likely to hit your opponent's face. You got Berry Blast. If you don't have your Blooming Hearts, you can just use something with high attack like the Poison Shroom, for example. This can do 3 damage to your opponent's face. And in the late game, in this particular deck, we're using strike through cards. So even though for a 4-cost card 3 attack is not a lot, the fact that strike through will ensure that you keep on hitting your opponent's face and finish off your opponent. Same with Elderberry, which can do 5 strike through if it's evolved, and the Power Flower. This is sort of the simplest way to win. Usually you're going with high attack minions, but it is possible to do it with bullseye minions instead. I'll give you this example. Here's Aggro Infinity. It's going to be the same thing. You are going to be using, this is not necessarily a high attack minion, but it is a bullseye minion. This will be doing significant bullseye damage to your opponent's face. Also, Conman, it doesn't do a lot, but it does bullseye. The reason why bullseye works with aggro and PvZ heroes is that if you can prevent your opponent from blocking, the block meter is the biggest weakness of aggro decks. And if they're not going to be blocking, you'll be able to finish them off quickly without them really getting their superpowers, which will help them control you. The weakness of aggro decks, of course, are decks with a lot of controlling powers. Things like Bungee Plumber, things like the Chickening, like Weed Spray, things that can really clear efficiently the minions off the field. Since you really do have to finish them off really quickly, this has strike-through minions like Line Dancing Zombie, like Space Cowboy, Pogo in this deck, for example. It's nice to have a little bit of removal to remove your opponent's minions so you can keep on hitting face. That's why Pogo mixed up Gravedigger is so good. Let me explain a little bit about the curve in aggro decks. You are typically going to have a lot of early game cards. There's some aggro decks you can even have a lot of early game cards. I'll actually give you an example here of Professor Brainstorm. Here's a Mustache aggro deck. In this deck, we're running a lot of 1s just because you can really swarm the minion with a lot of cards. Usually you want to also have, again, some way of removing your opponent's minions off the field, since they're going to start playing minions on the field and you want a way to get rid of them. Bungee Plumber is a great way. Exploding Fruitcake is a great way. You can also have tricks and environments that are going to buff up your guys and give them extra attack just to finish off your opponents. And usually you want to have some kind of finisher. So in this deck, it is the Shield Crusher Viking, which you'll play onto a Mustache Monument to do a bonus attack. This is just a kind of a combo which will do a nice 7 damage finisher. In the Aggro Solar Flare deck I showed you before, the finisher again is going to be the Strike Through. That's pretty simple. Let's just move right along over here. Into tempo. Tempo means to have more stats on the field than your opponent, which means you're really usually gonna be building up your field slowly, or having one turn where you put a ton of stats. Stats are attack and health onto the field. The best example for tempo decks in this game that are really effective, here's another budget deck for you beginner players, is the Smash Sports. You're going to be playing Arm Wrestler on 1, which again is a hard card to remove. This will grow. You can start shoving things into the Arm Wrestler to make it grow even more with the Sumo. And the main cards in a deck like this, for example, are Team Mascot. Very difficult card to remove if played just dry on turn 3. And this will grow all of your sports zombies. Slowly but surely. So this is a great example of when tribal synergy, the tribe here is sports, really does help this deck, because again, it's going to help you grow your minions slowly but surely and out-tempo your opponents. It's not just the tribal synergy, it's because it helps this be a effective tempo deck. Sport Zombie Coach also, again, it protects your guys. So your guys are going to be damaging the opponent and their plans, and your guys are going to be protected, ensuring that you will have more attack, more health, and more minions on the field than your opponent. It's super important in tempo decks to have a finisher, because if you're slowly but surely building up your cards, you have to have a way of, again, you have to have a win condition, which is doing 20 damage to your opponent's face. If you just have a way of getting big guys, you don't have a way of breaking through, you're not going to win the game. That's why in decks like this, cards like Going Viral are super important, because after you have that big sports field established with all, four lanes filled with zombies, or 5 lanes actually, in this deck filled with sports zombies, you have to have a way of making them frenzy, making them hit face. It's also nice to have cards like Alien Ooze, which can remove a big plant out of the way, again, in order to finish off your opponent. That's the point of Alien Ooze in a deck like that. I'm going to show you a tempo deck on the plant side. It's going to be sort of a similar thing. It will be the Nightcap Mushroom deck. Very simple deck, actually. Again, in this version of the deck, on turn 1, you're going to be playing Shroom for 2. You got to make sure you're obviously paying attention to what the opponent could play to counter your plays. But if you play Shroom for 2 on turn 1, this is very good stats. It's 2-2 with the team up, and then you can play, let's say, Puff Shroom and Buff Shroom on turn 2. Which will give you a bunch of 2-2s on the field, and then eventually you can play Pine Clone, which will give you a bunch of 3-3s onto the field. It's nice to play Punish Room in a deck like this, because anytime one of your mushrooms will die, this will do 2 damage to one of the zombies. And that will, again, ensure that you have more minions, more stats on the field. You gotta, again, though, have a finisher. So the finishers in this deck is either going to be Gloom Shroom, which you're going to play onto one of your mushrooms and do 3 damage splash to remove some of your minions, their opponent minions, off the field so you can push to face. Berry Blast is also a good way of removing minions. Punish Room can remove their minions, and Sonic Bloom is a finisher. Since you end up with a lot of little mushrooms in a deck like this is going to be a nice punch to your opponent. This will do that extra damage you really need to finish off your opponent, so you have a finisher. So in tempo decks, you typically want your curve to be pretty balanced. So 1 drops, you want to have usually like 8 1s, and then 8 cards that cost 2, and about 8 cards that cost 3. You can obviously make little adjustments like we do in this deck. And then the 4s, you kind of want to slow down. You maybe want there to be, sometimes you run 8 if they're really good, but you can just have 6 4s, and then 5s, you don't have to have too many, and you really want your deck to be concise like that. I'll go back to the sports deck just for the example's sake and explain the curve too. Here also we have 7 1s, We got 8 twos if you count the environment. The 3 and the 4 is really when this deck starts to really shine. So that's why we're emphasizing that a little bit more. The team mascot, the coach are the best cards, and Rodeo can be used as a late game card and finisher. So the deck's curve is put together really, really well. Alright, moving right along, the third type of deck, and again, this is the way that you do 20 damage to your opponent's face, is Control. The first Control deck I will show you, this is probably the simplest example of a Control deck, is Control Wall Knight. Control means you are removing everything your opponent plays off the field, and the way you win is by overpowering them with your super late game, super powerful cards. So the super powerful cards in the late game in this deck are Walnut Bowling. This can do 18 damage to your opponent's face, or will at least completely wipe out your opponent from the ground lane. Cornucopia will put a minion in every single lane. Three-Headed Chomper is also somewhat of a finisher, somewhat of a control card. This not only will remove your opponent's minions off the field, but will also put a big guy onto the field. Now, I would not suggest for beginner players to play control decks. First of all, they require a very strong knowledge of the game, of what the opponent types of cards the opponent can play. You have to be very careful. You don't need as many 1-drops, for example, in the control deck. We actually only have 4 copies of a 1-drop, but this is going to, remove your small minions the opponent plays. It also splashes around, so it can sort of do 1 damage to everything that they play. Grave Busters are very good nowadays in the meta because there's a lot of Gravestone decks, but there are some times that really the zombie players aren't playing that many Gravestones, so you don't want to run 4 Grave Busters. Hot Date is going to be removing things. Pear Cup is a very good control card because if you stick this in front of even a very big zombie, this will do 1 damage and then it'll turn to a Grizzly Pear and do 5 more. Very good control card. Squash is obviously a control card, and cards like Wingnut, sometimes you can, instead of actually controlling, you can just play like Wingnut, which will prevent their offense, which is really the same thing. You're just stalling for time for the late game. So there's 2 reasons why beginner players shouldn't play control as often. First of all, you really have to understand what the opposing, card's going to be played in order to really play this effectively. Second of all, almost all control decks are going to be very expensive, so you're going to have some nice late game finishers. Most of the late game finishers in this game are legendaries, in order to make it worth it. Right when I started playing the game, I didn't have a lot of legendaries. I really didn't play control that much because it just was too expensive. I'm going to show you another control deck on the zombie side. This is a very interesting type of control, but it really brings out the example of what a control deck can do. This is a control imp deck. The way that you stall for time and remove everything off the field that your opponent plays is just by swarming the field with a ton of imps. The imp throwing imp is throwing things around the field, and then you have a lot of deadly cards like Toxic Waste Imp and the Cosmic Imp. So you actually are going to be teleporting these in front of where your opponent plays plants to remove them. The deadly's a really effective way. You're drawing cards all the while with your imp commander, and then you're really stalling for that late game finisher. The late game finisher is Bad Moon Rising, which again will turn your little tiny imps, anything you have left on the field, all your little swabbies will turn them into huge cards. And Plankwalker is another great example of the finisher. You play this on the field, it creates a huge 6/6 strike through. And it also creates 2 other minions, which again is such a difficult, such an efficient play for just 8 brains. Very difficult for your opponent to counter it, so that's how you finish off opponents. So again, there's a lot of different ways you can control opponents. This is a very unique one you're looking at. But the typical way is you have a lot of removal cards like the first deck that I showed you to remove everything your opponent plays off the field. So those are the 3 main ways, again, of doing 20 damage to your opponent's face. Quickly, tempo is gradual, and control is very slow, and doing big finishers at the end. Now I'm going to get into some of the other deck types that you've probably seen me refer to, and they are right over here. I'm going to talk about Ramp, Midrange, and Miracle. And to be honest, Ramp, Midrange, and Miracle decks are all actually just variants on aggro, tempo, and control. So I'll go through these one at a time. A ramp deck means you are gaining extra brains or sun every single turn. I'll show you an example of this right over here. We got I'll show you the plants first just because it's simpler. I'll show you this Chompzilla deck. This is Troller Chompzilla. Now, most ramp decks are actually control decks on steroids, meaning it's going to be the same thing as a control deck. You're removing everything your opponent plays off the field. If they play a 1 cost, for example, you're going to try to put a Primal Sunflower in front of it. Use the Sweet Pea to remove their cards. Use your Briar Rose and your Cob Cannons to remove their cards. And stall for the late game until you can get the big finish with your Cornucopia or your Cob Cannon or whatever the Captain Cucumber happens to conjure. Those will be your late game cards in a deck like this. The only difference about ramp is that you're speeding up the process. Instead of just stalling for time, you're also making proactive plays to try to get extra sun using Sunflower, or Solar Winds is also a good ramp card. This will give you sunflowers, which will give you extra sun, so it just speeds up the time until the late game. I'll give you an example of ramp on the zombie side. Sorry, that's not ramp. We're gonna go to a different huge giganticus deck that is a ramp deck. Here's a ramp Bad Moon Rising. So this deck is concentrating very much on getting, again, you're controlling in the early game. You're by swarming your minions, by using Pogo mixed up Gravedigger to keep on bouncing everything they play off the field. But eventually, you're really just stalling for a time for the big finishers, which are mixed up Gravedigger and Bad Moon Rising. Ramp just speeds it up. So a card like Nebula, for example, which is probably the main ramp card on the zombie side, this will make you play that big, expensive 7-cost Bad Moon Rising earlier. For example, if you have Nebula on the field, this gives you 2 extra brains when a minion's played. If you were to play, let's say, a Swabby into it, which costs 0, even on turn 5, you'll then have 7 brains. If you were to play a bunch of Swabbies and Brain Vendors, which also essentially are free, you'll be able to play this earlier. That's what a ramp deck is. Okay, I'm gonna keep going on. Ramp decks are very unique. What should the curve be? You obviously have to just concentrate on how are you going to survive long enough to get your late game to really survive while you're ramping, and really to try to set up that ramp combo, make sure it's efficient. That's all I can really say in general about ramp decks. Now, I do sometimes refer to decks as mid-range decks. That will be the second one you see over there. We're going to go, and I'll give you a couple examples of this over here. So the first mid-range deck I can show you, this is just one of many examples, is this deck, the King's New Pet. Now, this is a deck where you are, again, you're not doing that much in the early game. Maybe you're controlling them with a card like Flick or like Weed Spray or Rocket. You're maybe teleporting in some minions with Teleportation Zombie in order to stall for time. But a mid-range is just a faster control deck. Control decks, what I refer to as control decks, are you're stalling for time and you're finishing them off in turns 6, 7, 8, or 9, or 10. That would be a control deck. A mid-range deck is the same thing, but you're really stalling for 1 or 2 or 3 turns, and then you really start hitting them with the heavy tempo. So for this deck, for example, you're basically stalling until turn 4, and then you're trying to Teleportation Zombie in one of your cards like Stompidon. The Stompidon, every time you draw cards, will then start buffing the cards in your hand, and then you can start putting on some heavy tempo, more stats, because your cards are just going to have more stats than your opponent, and you finish them off with the going viral. It's the same thing if you teleport a king in. If you can sort of stall for turn 4 and get a king and turn something into a knight, very difficult for the opponent to catch up with you. This deck is also sort of a ramp deck because it does have Cryo Brain in it. If you play Cryo Brain on 2, then you can play one of your main cards, the Stompidon of the King, on turn 3, which is a very difficult card for them to remove. So that is an example of a mid-range deck. Again, you're just controlling, stalling for time, and then finishing them off. Instead of in the super late game, turns 6 and 9, you're doing it turns 3, 4, and 5. I'll give you an example of a plant mid-range deck. The best example of a plant mid-range deck, I would say, is actually Cycle Cat. You all know this deck. This is, again, you're stalling the first couple turns. If they play too many minions on the field, you're removing them a little bit with Lima Pleurodon. You're removing them with Berry Blast or with your Spring Beans. But really the main way that you destroy opponents with in a mid-range deck like this, you set up your Planet of the Grapes on the field, and you play a Astro Shroom into it, and then you start playing a lot of minions and you keep on drawing cards and you really finish them off efficiently. Again, it's really starting on around turns 4. That's usually when you start doing it. You can also use Pine Clones in this deck to, again, you're stalling for the first couple turns, and then you hit them with this huge Pine Clone play, which again, you're really out-tempoing your opponent starting on turn 4 or 5, something like that. Nightcap could be called also a miracle deck, and that is the next deck that I will explain. Nightcap is weird. It's sort of a mix between a miracle and a mid-range deck. Again, all these little decks are sort of similar in this sense. What is a miracle deck? A miracle deck is a deck where you are, it's very similar to a mid-range or a control deck, but instead of putting heavy tempo on the field, stalling for time for heavy tempo, you're stalling time for a very big combo that usually involves a lot of cards. So I'll give you 2 examples of miracle decks right over here, just for an example. One example, let's say, is Savage Starfruit. This deck, you are, again, stalling for time. They put a minion, you remove it with Bonk Choy. Maybe they put something else, you're going to remove it. Try to use your Rotobagas and your Beanstalks to stall for time. But then you really set up your big play by either using a Savage Spinach or an Onion Rings. These will increase the attack of your guys dramatically, so you'll actually be able to, after you play Onion Rings, start swarming the field with a bunch of little 1-cost cards, which are actually going to be 4 attack and 4 health each. So again, this is a miracle. You're sort of building up cards in your hand and then playing them all at once. This deck is also a mid-range deck because, again, if you play your Onion Rings and you have a Starfruit in your hand, you can just play Starfruit on the field as a 4/4. This will be a huge card which will do 4 damage in every single lane, and you can then use bonus attacks to finish off your opponents. Mid-range and Miracle are actually very similar. We are going to I'm going to show you a Miracle deck for the zombie side. We're going to go to a Rust Bolt deck. This is Miracle Leap Knights. One of the ways, I'm not going to explain all the ins and outs of this deck, but one of the ways is to win with this deck is to stall for time, have a teleportation zombie on the field, teleport in 2 or 3 teachers, which will make all of your tricks cost less, and then come in with a huge combo of tricks, particularly a huge cycle of going virals. If you were to have 3 teachers on the field, for example, going viral will be free, so this will grow all of your minions and your teachers by 1 and give them frenzy, and then they'll draw a card, and it keeps on shuffling these into your deck, and you keep on playing them until you just end up in 1 turn with just this huge combo of many cards played, which will finish off your opponent. Alright, so those are the basic types of decks. There are other things called mill, where you're trying to fill your opponent's hands with cards, which isn't very relevant in this game anymore. But these are really the main understandings, and if I had to give one piece of advice for you when you're making a deck, don't just look for synergy, just try to figure out very clearly, how am I going to win? How am I going to do that precious 20 damage to the opponent's face? Heal decks, for example, any deck with healing would be considered control, because instead of removing your opponent's minions off the field, instead you're stalling for time in a different way, which is by, as they damage you, you keep on healing yourself. So any heal deck is definitely going to be a control. I'm going to talk about 2 more things that I want to talk to you about in this game. One of them is tricks. A lot of people will look at a deck and they think that it's mandatory, you have to have tricks in the deck. And it's really not true at all. You don't have to have any tricks in some decks, and some decks you just have to have very few tricks. So I can give you some examples of decks with almost no tricks. I mean, the sports, what would be a good example of a deck with very few tricks? Here's a really good example of a deck, a very effective deck, and the only tricks are 3 copies of bonus decks. You don't need tricks, particularly if you're plants. For example, plants have the luxury of being able to control your opponent with minions, since your opponent has to play the zombies, and then you get to react by playing a minion. Bonk Choy is almost as good as a trick that does 3 damage and costs 1, because you can just stick this in front of any zombie that's played. So huge misconception that you definitely don't necessarily need tricks. Only use tricks if they're necessary. The last thing I'm going to talk about is environments. Typically, unless your deck really relies on environments for a lot, sometimes you can run a lot of environments in a deck, but typically you want there to be 3 or 4 environments in your deck. There are some decks where you don't have room for them. This is another great example of a deck that's actually better with no environments. If you're able to really control what your opponent's playing on the field, remove their minions off the field, you don't really have to worry that much about your environments. You can really try to kill them before their environments are going to have enough of an effect. You have to this deck, for example, Valk Trickster Hybrid, the reason I run no environments is because you need a lot of minions for Valkyrie in order to buff up the Valk, and you need a lot of tricks in order to make your Trickster cost less, so there's no room for environments in a deck. Otherwise, typically in a deck, though, you do want there to be 3 or 4 environments, even if they're not going to be helping your deck per se. You just want to have environments in order to cover your opponent's environments off the field. It's almost sort of a way of controlling your opponent. For example, Savage Starfruit, this is a deck that if there were no environments in the game, it would be fine. I ran 2, and again, sometimes this can really help you do more damage. The Coffee Grounds gives a guy double strike, but mostly this is just to remove the environments that the zombies play. Alright guys, so that is the end of the tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed. This is going to, again, the main thing you got to do is make sure you have a very solid win condition in your deck. If you follow these steps and really stick to the main deck archetypes, which are Aggro, Temper, and Control, you'll be able to make decks completely by yourself. Hope you guys enjoyed. Peace. This is Fry.